The lectionary is a really helpful tool for a couple of reasons, and it's important to recognize it is a tool. It didn't fall from heaven. It was something that the church put together, which does not recommend against it. Much of what we do in worship we have devised has been given to us over the centuries by the collective wisdom of the church. Lectionary is really helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it puts a discipline on the preacher. By having a pattern of readings over 3 years, we are likely to tread more biblical territory than we would if left to our own devices. That is, most of us will want to preach on the same passages, or at least the same themes, the ones that are our bread and butter, the ones that are central to our theology again and again and again. And there's something really powerful about that. But it allows the very real possibility that over a couple of years, people get a fairly thin slice of theology or a thin slice of the biblical narrative. And the lectionary forces you to read, to hear, even if you don't preach on it all, it forces us to listen to a lot more of the biblical story than we might otherwise. The second thing that's really powerful about the lectionary is that it tells a story. And it's designed, there's no haphazardness about it. Well, sometimes the way the texts match together feels a little haphazard. But the overarching design follows the church year. And essentially there are two broad movements in the church year. The first, from Advent through the end of Easter, is all about Jesus. And it's essentially trying to answer the question, who is this Jesus? And so we begin with his birth and actually the foretelling of his birth. And then the birth and his baptism and that significance, then his baptism and the collecting of the disciples, and then kind of jumps in the gospel narrative. It jumps to his journey to Jerusalem, the events around cross, resurrection, and then reflecting on the resurrection. So there's this real clear, even though it skips a lot of parts of the plot, it has this thematic unity of trying to answer the question, who is Jesus? The second part of the church year, the season of Pentecost, is really about the church. And the question it's trying to answer is kind of assuming you've learned who Jesus is. The question it's trying to answer is, what does it mean to be a disciple of this Jesus? What does it mean to be a follower of this one? And so then you kind of go back to some of the scenes of collecting the disciples, and then through the Pentecost season, from Pentecost, the creation of the church, collecting of disciples, through a lot of the teaching and miracle stories that we skipped over before, that now form the basis of the season of Pentecost, where then we can learn and think about what does it mean to be his follower, what does it mean to be the church, and how do we promote the growth of the church. So those are two things that really powerfully commend the lectionary. Now, having said that, the lectionary is not perfect, and there are two things I want to say about that too. One, sometimes the texts that are laid beside each other are laid together for fairly superficial reasons. This is particularly true of the Old Testament reading. The gospel is what the lectionary is keyed off of. And normally, the Old Testament passage is chosen because somehow it supports or anticipates or complements the theme of the gospel. Sometimes it does that beautifully, and sometimes it does that fairly artificially. It might just be a word about feeding or a rock, and then we hear a story about a feeding or a vineyard or a rock in the Old Testament, and it just completely does not do justice to the passage itself. So when you're reading or working with lectionary, we need to always be aware, one, certainly of how do these texts come together and tell the story of who is Jesus, what does it mean to be his follower, but also allow ourselves to listen to the text discreetly too, for their own witness, and avoid the temptation of always reading the Old Testament passages through the lens of a particular gospel theme. And so there's a tension there. When do they come together well? And when do we really listen to one discreetly on its own terms? I myself favor, for the most part, preaching on one text and doing that justice. But I know there are times where they really overlap, and you can sound a second theme, or sometimes even a third or fourth, depending on how they go. But I think 3/4 of my own preaching probably has a center of gravity, at least, in one text. The other thing out of the lectionary is that it is just fine to set it aside for a period. And that when you're doing that, you're not bucking the system or being anti-church or anti-your tradition. There are whole traditions that don't use the lectionary at all, and we can learn from some of the strengths and weaknesses of their experience. But even lectionary traditions can set the lectionary aside for the season of Lent or part of the summer and allow real biblical study to treat an important book of the Bible and to take that seriously, to give people a greater sense of the scriptural witness. One of the nice things about the lectionary is very recently, for the Pentecost season at least, there's an alternative reading for the Old Testament, which does just that. It moves through the major narrative so that over 3 years you've covered most of the plot line, the important plot line of the Old Testament. And I'm all for taking a series of Sundays and allowing people to be immersed in that part of the biblical narrative really fully.